Hello, welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. I'm Andrew Musgrove, joined by our Newcastle United writer Sean McCormick, once again in Lees's Park, in the shadow of St James's Park. And what a lovely afternoon it is to be here. We've got plenty of questions for Sean to ask. You guys have sent them in by the dozen, so thank you very much, whether that's across social media or indeed the email address, which is the eibwpodcast@reachplc.com. Do send in your questions and your thoughts for us to answer. Big thanks to Saily and NordVPN as well for their support of the podcast, who without we couldn't be bringing you the content for free. Do hit the links in the podcast description box to sign up and get a discounted offer on both products. Saily, the eSIM provider, which will help you stay connected abroad, and NordVPN allows you to browse safely on public Wi-Fi. Sean, welcome back to the show. You keeping well?
All good, yeah. Just had a few days off over the international break. I think much needed after an intense run of games, which obviously ended in the Derby defeat, which there was a bit of a brutal reaction to that afterwards. I think everyone's needed the break, the reset. And now, of course, we're 5-6 days out from Newcastle return to Premier League action. I like to think there's a bit more positive energy going into that. It still feels quite a long way away. It feels like a long time actually since that Derby defeat. But such a hugely important end of the season coming up for Newcastle and for Eddie Howe, of course. Which I'm sure we'll get into in the podcast. I think that David Hopkinson's comments last week when the club revealed their financial results left a bit of room for interpretation, shall we say, on Eddie Howe's future. So I think that's going to be absolutely huge in terms of how Newcastle end the season, in terms of his future. And I'm sure I'm going to get into that in the questions, so I'm not labour on too much at this stage.
Well, that's the first question that's coming. A lot of people wanted to know your thoughts on whether you think Sunday against Palace, 2 o'clock kickoff down at Selhurst Park, is it a must-win for Eddie Howe?
I think so, yeah. I think not in terms of his immediate future. If they get beat off Crystal Palace, I can't see any rash decision being made in terms of Eddie Howe leaving the club or anything like that. But I just think the feeling that everyone connected to the club has festered on the last 3 weeks, whether that be fans, reporters, Eddie Howe himself, the players. It's been tough, the reaction to that Sunderland defeat, a reaction that was merited, of course, and a reaction to a Premier League season, which at this stage, if the season ended tomorrow, Newcastle finishing 12th place, by all accounts, is just not good enough. So I think they need that sort of bolt, I think, that sort of positive shot on the arm to get the season back in a positive upward direction. I think Crystal Palace historically away has been a tough game for Newcastle, but if you look at the sort of circumstances heading into this fixture, they're obviously going to play in the European quarter-final on Thursday. They'll have the second leg of that after Newcastle's visit to Selhurst Park on Sunday, and their form has been stuttering this season. They're not the Crystal Palace of last season that won the FA Cup and blew teams away and had Oliver Glasner linked with all kinds of top jobs. It sort of went a bit stale down there in terms of his future. He's obviously leaving the club in the summer. I think all their eggs are in the European basket. They're not going to go down unless there's a miraculous turn of events. So it's an opportunity, I think, for Newcastle to go away from home. They don't have the sort of the pressure cooker of having to win at St James's Park in this game, at least. Hopefully players coming back. I mean, the message we got before the international break was that Bruno would be pushing to be back for this game, Fabian Schar pushing to be back for this game, Lewis Miley. I mean, not all three of those will probably start the game, but just to have them back involved will be a huge boost for Newcastle. I said before I went away for a few days that the difference now in terms of having one game a week and the training time Eddie Howe's got to have the players and the break that they've had now after such a grueling period, that should really help them, I think, heading into this stage of the season. So it feels like a must-win for the mood. And obviously, of course, if they don't win the game, it depends on where that then leaves them in terms of the race for Europe as well, because if the other teams around them win, it almost seems very, very difficult for Newcastle to turn around with just 6 games to go. And I think, unless I'm mistaken, Everton and Brentford play each other this weekend, so one of those two is going to lose points as well. So opportunity knocks Newcastle, and I think they've got to take it for all the reasons I've outlined there.
I think for me, it is a must-win for Eddie Howe, given what Dave Hopkinson said about 7 games left. That's kind of what we're focusing on, because you need to win that first of the 7 to ensure you go into the final 6 in the best possible spirit. Because if they lose against Palace, and the next game, the week after against Bournemouth, I think it is, that's going to be a huge game here at St James's Park. And you get the feeling that they lose against Palace, then everyone rocks up to St James's Park a week on Saturday in bad spirits, and we don't want that. A win would certainly stop that from happening. Question 2 comes from Davey, who's emailed in and wants to know your thoughts, Sean, on the sale of the stadium. This, of course, was revealed last week with the accounts, and essentially the club sold St James's Park to another company which is owned by the club's majority shareholders. Doing so allowed them to post a profit, although the club maintained it was a move which will benefit them whatever they do when it comes to a stadium in the future, whether that's move or stay and expand. So essentially they denied it was some sort of clever accounting trick to do with PSR. But the question from Davey is whether you think it is a big deal, and namely, should the fans have been consulted before it happened?
I don't think it's necessarily the biggest deal in terms of that I don't think the motive is sinister in this case, whereas I think obviously the circumstances around St James's Park is always a sensitive topic. And obviously it goes back to when it got renamed under Mike Ashley, when it became the Sports Direct Arena for a bit. And obviously the uproar then was the fact that the fans weren't consulted, and it wasn't necessarily something that was bringing in huge amounts of profit for Newcastle at the time. It was more advertising tool for the owner and his other business interests. Now, in this case, I mean, they can deny that it's not an accounting trick, but the reality of it is that if they didn't do that, they would have failed PSR last season. So they can say that it's to benefit the future stadium projects, and I mean that is true as well. But the cold hard reality of it is, if they didn't do it, they would have failed PSR, and that would have come with it potential point deductions, massive fines. And unfortunately, it's just the way that the rules are. I think we spend so much time now talking about PSR, and next season it'll be squad cost ratio as well. And it's almost like the lunacy of it is that we're so bogged down by finances that we're losing point of what the actual meaning of football is. Like, we shouldn't be in a situation, I think, where Newcastle are exploiting a loophole to avoid failing PSR, and Chelsea have done it, of course, with their stadium. Everton have done it. Aston Villa sold a car park, I believe. The list goes on and on and on. And while these rules are in place, you're going to find more and more of this stuff happens. And I think Newcastle sort of intimated that there might not be the last sort of accounting move that we see with some of their tangible assets. So in short, to the long way of just answering that question, I think fans should always be consulted with something that's so delicate as is St James's Park, but I don't think the motives were necessarily ones that were, going to be damaging towards the club. They did it to safeguard themselves against PSR. They did it to hopefully maximise the profits that they can bring in for future stadium projects and future stadium renovations if it comes down to it. So, yeah, it's I don't know what you think, but I think it is an interesting one with the stadium. I just think it's such a delicate topic that I guess what's more annoying for the fans is they've only found out about it now, whereas it happened back in June 2025. So you're talking 9 months where this has happened. There's been no mention of it at all. And I think that's where the sort of element of doubt sort of creeps in. So why haven't they just been transparent about it? So yeah, I think that's I've probably answered that in a long-winded way there, Davey, but I don't think there's anything sinister towards it, but I always think when it comes to stadium, transparency is key. And I think that's a lesson they can learn moving forward, going into the big stadium decision they're going to have with it and move away from St James's Park. Because I did think that was, of everything that came out from the accounts, that was the one thing that seemed to irk a lot of fans, wasn't it? That they weren't consulted, there was no mention of this before, and if there's nothing to hide, which I don't necessarily think it is, I don't think there's anything sort of sinister behind it, then just be upfront and transparent about it.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it there. It's so a delicate situation around St James's Park. Me and Mark Crothers did a show earlier this week all about the future of it, and that's provoked a lot of debate in the comments, and me and Mark were torn as well because there's so much emotion surrounding the stadium. So something as big as this, I can understand why some people were a little bit put out, but I agree with you. I think and I hope it was done with the best interests of Newcastle at heart, i.e. posting a profit and also taking them at face value. And they say it's to kind of move with speed about the next stage of either St James's Park or new ground. So take them at face value and let's see what doors that indeed does open. So the third question of today's episode then comes from Dan, and he asks whether you think Kieran Trippier's exit at the end of the season suggests that Newcastle United are confident in keeping Tino Livramento at the club beyond the summer.
I don't think it makes too much of a difference on that, to be honest. This is my first chance to actually say about Kieran Trippier before we get into the Tino Livramento answer. I was off last week when the news was announced, and to me, I don't know if you agree, I still feel like he's the most important signing Newcastle have made, certainly post-takeover, arguably of the the 21st century. I think the impact he had on Newcastle, both in terms of the fact he was like the gateway signing, and he came from Atletico Madrid where he was the Liga champions. He joined a relegation fight, and the quality, the leadership, the standards he instilled in a team that had been struggling just gave everyone a massive lift. And I think you look back to, I mean, he got injured actually in that first half season, but the performance he put in before that injury against Everton always sticks out, where he scored the free kick, but he pretty much ran the game that day from right back. Then obviously the following season when Newcastle finished fourth and he was the best right back in the league, he got in the team of the year. Since then he's had his moments of course as well, but you look back to the quality and the impact then, what a player he's been in Newcastle United. I think he's probably, certainly in my lifetime, the best right back I've seen at the club, but you go into most people's all-time Newcastle United 11 and that's a testament to the impact he's made at the club. Now, I think I touched on this last time I was on the podcast with you. The annoying thing about the Trippier Livramento situation was that Livramento was bought in that position of strength where he was supposed to be the replacement that was already in the building for Kieran Trippier, and that could still be the case as there's time between now and the end of the season where they could make an impact in those contract negotiations. Of course, David Hopkinson said last week that if Newcastle have to sell a couple of their star players, they will do in a much more prepared fashion than they did with Alexander Isak last year. You'd think that, you know, the front runners for that are Sandro Tonali, Tino Livramento, and maybe Anthony Gordon, but I would say it's more Tonali, Livramento that you've got a big chance of losing this summer. You know, Man City have caught Livramento for a long time. Arsenal have been linked with him as well. So I think it's interesting to see. I think if you don't see any sort of impact of that contract negotiation between now and June, then I think it's probably safe to say that Newcastle may have to sell Tino Livramento. And again, I think I've touched on it in a previous podcast before, how much I think he's a fantastic player and his best years are certainly ahead of him. The injury record this season's been a bit worrying. His performances since coming back from injury in recent weeks have been below par. So I think he's got a big end of the season to prove his quality again. Obviously, he wants to get in the England World Cup squad. He was involved in the England squad in the recent internationals. I think he's got a big end of the season, whether that's to earn a new contract at Newcastle or to prove that he's worthy of joining these big clubs. And for Newcastle, if he is going to leave, then obviously driving up a big fee as well. And then the job that they then got in their hands is, with Trippier definitely going, I mean, Emil Krafth's going to be leaving the club as well, barring something changing massively in the mindset of both him and Newcastle. And if Tino goes as well, then you're in a position where you're going to have to sign 2 right backs this summer. And I don't think when you brought Tino into the club from Southampton 3 years ago that you ever envisaged that would be the situation. I think obviously the hope would have been that Harrison Ashby kicked on as well, and then Tino and Ashby would have been the 2 right backs already in the build when Trippier left. But the irony of it all being that 3 years down the line, we could be in a situation where they're going for 2 right backs.
Well, some people would say you've got Lewis Miley there to fill in potentially.
Maybe, yeah.
That's maybe not what everyone wants, but certainly going to be interesting to see what does happen in the summer with the right back situation. I think Livramento probably will go, and I think it'll be for big money, and that's got to be reinvested correctly. But I would like to think, as you've mentioned there, the lessons from the Isak saga have been learned. So Kieran Trippier has confirmed to be going. They've already got the list and they're already really cracking on to not only replace Kieran Trippier, but they know who they want to get if indeed Tino Livramento goes out, and that deal has to be done as soon as possible as well. I know the World Cup's coming up, but I'd still like to think that if that's going to happen, that deal, that exit, then they do it as soon as possible so that we're not waiting around to get a replacement in. One of the questions I was going to ask later on, but you've mentioned him there, Emil Krafth. There were quite a few questions about what happens next in terms of the players who are in a similar boat to Kieran Trippier with their deals running down. Emil Krafth, of course, is one, and Fabian Schar the other. Is it time to get ruthless and cut them both off just like Kieran Trippier?
I think certainly with Krafth, I think the end has come to it's a perfect timing, I think, for him to go. He hasn't really been involved this season, had a few injuries. I think there was talk of him going to Copenhagen in January. I think he's been a decent servant at Newcastle. He's sort of been that man who just keeps getting the 1 year rolling contract, hasn't he? But I think he can look back on his contribution and to the club and be pretty happy with himself from where he come from, joining under the Steve Bruce era and sort of cement himself as a bit of a cult hero, I guess, at times. But the reality of his situation now, he just isn't anywhere near the first team, and I think Newcastle need to have a clean break from that situation. Fabian Schar is an interesting one because he's been fantastic for Newcastle. Eddie Howe loves him, thinks he's a big character in the dressing room. Obviously, he's got obvious quality in terms of not only defensively, but the way he can sort of drive forward with the ball, the way that he can break lines with his passing. He's probably, if you look at the other defensive options they've got in the centre, Newcastle, he's the only one that can really do that with real aplomb. And And I think replacing that, obviously long term, they've got to have someone coming through the door that is going to be replace them. It'd be interesting to see whether they deem him worthy of one more year. I'm sort of inclined to think he will be, but I think either way, I think the decisiveness of the Kieran Trippier decision that they've come out already and said he's not staying at the club. I like to think that they've sort of made that similar decision with Fabian Schar already. We might not know it, of course, at this stage.
As in for him to leave and go?
As in like they've already probably made a decision either way. Because I think to announce Trippier leaving with 7 games to go suggests that they're already sort of getting their ducks in a row and really, as you say, learning from the mistakes of last summer.
I guess Trippier was a bit of a surprise to some. It wasn't a clean cut, 100%. He needs to go for everybody.
No, yeah.
And I get Fabian Schär. It's more weighted, I think, to him staying in the minds of the majority. Yeah. For me, I wouldn't be against him going. Of course, it depends on who you bring in, yes, etc. And get the argument that you could keep him for backup. Would he accept that though? Because I still think he'll have ambitions of being in the first team. But look, if Newcastle United start next season with him at centre back, I don't think that speaks too much about the progression of the project.
Yeah,
I think they're all the things that play into it. If he's happy to be a backup and know that he's there for cover, essentially, then sign him up. But if he's got ambitions of still being a first team regular, I just think Newcastle United, the direction they need to go in, I think it's time to say thank you very much. What a bargain you've been. Great servant. But we are going to move on to essentially someone younger.
I think that's the conversation they've got to have. And I don't think he would be the starter anyway. I think Malik Chow would be the starter and he'd be sort of like the backup right-sided option. I think what Newcastle have to weigh up is how much money they need to spend to kickstart this rebuild that we're sort of being briefed that they're going to have this summer, because it feels like it's going to be a rebuild. It feels like it's going to be a renewed sort of transfer strategy under Ross Wilson, a renewed sort of vision for where the club's going to go. At the minute, the signs point that Eddie Howe is going to be the man in charge of that rebuild, but it does feel like there is a change of the guard and a change of the direction. It just depends. I think the share decision comes down basically to, do they think in their mind they can get away with one more year of not addressing that centre-half situation, or if they do, they bring in a youngster where the pressure isn't necessarily on him to come straight into the team and play 20, 25 games. Fabian Schär's sort of there to do that while they bring him on in the club, a bit like what Lewis Hall did in his first season, where he didn't really play that much, but he was learning and getting in the Newcastle way. And you've seen the results of that now, where he's probably the best left back in the Premier League. That could be a way forward of that, because I think you look at the position Newcastle need to strengthen in the summer. The goalkeeper straight away is got to be the absolute priority. They're going to possibly need 2 right backs. They need a backup left back for Lewis Hall. They need a midfielder if Joe Willock goes, which is a possibility because he's been linked with a few Premier League clubs, and I think he's probably one of those where you're saying there he's itching for more game time. He's had it in recent weeks through injuries and the amount of competition Newcastle are playing, but I think you'll see in these next 7 games how far down the pecking order Joe Willock actually is in terms of the 6 midfielders at the club.
It's not just like last summer. It was about improving the first 11, wasn't it? Yeah. That's what we thought we were getting with Nick Woltmade and Anthony Elanga and Malik Chow. But there were so many squad players who essentially could be cut this summer that you can't just say there's 120 million for 2, first team players, because you're still going to need to replace 3 or 4 squad players, and that is challenging,
especially if they're in Europe as well. So I think that's probably been a disappointing thing of the summer as well, because I think you looked at it and thought, other than a backup left back, they've probably got 2 players for each position. This is where, compared to the last European campaign, Newcastle are in a much better position to attack it in terms of the squad depth. And a couple of those signings haven't necessarily performed to the level. A couple of squad players, again, like you say, that Joe Willock, he could be one that goes on. Jacob Murphy's still at the club, who he could be another winger that possibly gets moved on. I think he's got a big 7 games coming up. There's a few players in that boat, isn't there, where it's like they're in that sort of transitional phase of, do they replace those squad players and go with this new vision? And as you say, like, again, the forward position as well, they've got 2 forwards who they spent a lot of money on who aren't performing at the minute. A big end of the season for both of those players. I think Johan Visser particularly needs to show something in the last 7 games to prove why Newcastle took such a gamble on him in the summer. Nick Woltmade, of course, been shifted position. I would like to see him go back up front in the last 7 games and prove why he has the quality to be a top Premier League forward. He has scored goals in the first half of the season. Germany still really retain the faith in him. So yeah, it's an interesting summer coming up, and I think those decisions on the likes of Fabian Schar are going to be weighted on where Newcastle place their priorities, because they've only got a set amount of money they can spend. They haven't got an endless pot of money, unfortunately, where they can play Football Manager or they can play FIFA career mode and change this. It isn't the case.
Jason has got in touch to ask about the links to Karim Koulibaly from Werder Bremen, 18-year-old centre-back. And Jason's more interested in whether you think that suggests a total change in the approach this summer, whereas last summer we mentioned Langer comes in for big money spent on other players as well. Do you think Newcastle are going to start to maybe target younger and unestablished players with the hope that they can quickly find their feet?
Yes, I do. I think I was struck when we met Ross Wilson and Dave Hopkinson in December by how quickly he said that the club are obviously going to target outside the Premier League because of the bigger value for money they can get from those divisions. Now, that requires obviously extensive scouting network. He said that the work had already gone in at that point, so he was 2 months into the role at that point of winding the recruitment network. There was a well-publicised move for the Nottingham Forest scout who's now become Newcastle's sort of lead scout in South America. I know that they've been targeting the Belgian region, which obviously Sunderland and Man United have had some success with in recent years. And Koulibaly is another one in Germany, an 18-year-old defender who's played 20-odd games this season in the Bundesliga, playing really well, Germany Youth International. And I think whether or not he ends up at Newcastle remains to be seen, but it does sort of signify, if you look at the players that they're being linked with and then we know that they're looking at and monitoring and scouting, they're all of a similar sort of age profile. They're all at clubs where you think you could extract value from those players, and you know, they either go on to become fantastic players for Newcastle or they get sold off for huge fees, and that's how Newcastle continue to pump money into the squad. I think it's been needed. I think you saw in the summer that Newcastle were hurt badly by not having that sort of structure in place. I mean, they didn't have a sporting director. They didn't really have a CEO. The summer before that, of course, they couldn't really spend any money at all. So I think this summer feels like the first summer since the Dan Ashworth era, really, where everything feels aligned. Everything feels like there's a clear vision. There's a clear sort of benchmark of this is what we're going to try and recruit each summer. And I think that can only help Newcastle. And I think if they sort of mould themselves an identity, really, because they don't really have that, I don't think, in the transfer market. I think to begin with, of course, it was sort of Premier League proven players mixed in with the sort of superstars that they bought. And even then, I'm saying superstars, but they weren't necessarily global superstars at the time. You think like Bruno Guimaraes, who got from Lyon, Sandro Tonali's from AC Milan, they've become superstars at Newcastle, but they were sort of, you always knew they were at that kind of level. And I think that's what Newcastle need to sort of mould for themselves. Because I think you look at like a Brighton, for example, you know exactly what their recruiting model, Brentford, you know what their recruiting model is. Newcastle isn't defined, and I think that's what Ross Wilson hopefully will bring. And I think players of Koulibaly, like you mentioned there, that's the sort of market that they are going to operate in. And I think they're the sort of players you're going to see Newcastle bring in this summer.
And a player like him, obviously we don't know too much about him, but it's a real difficult balance to snap up a player of 17, 18 and have him ready to be part of the first team squad.
Yeah.
Because at the same time, you could bring someone of that age who has to go into the youth system, for example, and spend 2 years there and getting ready and building up, especially someone who's coming from abroad. But we've just spoken in the last answer about them needing to replace squad players. So that challenge, if indeed that's where the transfer push is going to shift to, of snapping up youngsters of 18, 19, 20, 21, but having them ready to not only be part of the squad, but potentially be part of the first team. I mean, that's a difficult challenge to do.
It's a huge challenge, and I think that's where the extensive scouting comes into it. And I think you've got to be clever because every club buys youngsters who get put in the academy system, and not every one of them makes it. I mean, Newcastle have done that in recent years, where they've bought plenty of youngsters from abroad who haven't really been anywhere near the standard. Whereas I think if you look at, like, just take, for example, Sunderland signing Noah Siddiqui, who was brilliant in the derby, a young midfielder who come in and he yes, he'd only played in Belgium, but he played senior football and he was oven ready. And you look at, like, again, a Koulibaly profile, as I said there, he's played 20 odd times in the Bundesliga. You like to think that he would come in and be ready. And I think that's, again, the argument I was making there about Fabian Schar staying is that if he did bring in a 17, 18-year-old, but you did have Fabian Schar there as well as Malik Chow, you've then got like 3 options for one position who, you know, it doesn't necessarily put the pressure on that youngster to come in and really hit the ground running.
But does it also maybe show that Newcastle potentially are going to target a better class of youngsters, for want of a better phrase? Because we've seen them, the youngsters they've signed in recent years have all come in with the idea of them going into the youth system, and maybe in 18 months' time, you will then either go out on loan or then you'll maybe have a shot at the first team. Whereas I think, given the players we expect to go out in the summer, these players who are going to come in are going to have to be ready to play a major part in the first team. You look at someone like Cordero, who had played a lot of times for Malaga.
Yeah.
His loan deals have gone pretty badly, but it was never the idea that he was going to be part of the first team anyway. And I think that's kind of going to be a really interesting thing to watch in the summer, whether you sign someone like Cordero with that plan, youth system loan, or whether it's someone like Koulibaly, for example, come in first team and competing as well for the first team.
I think that is the profile they're going to go for, and I think there's obviously an element of risk with that, and I think that there's an element of risk with any transfer, and the amount of times you see the phrase, and I've written it myself, like Premier League ready, oven ready, plug in and start signings. But that's what Anthony Elanga was, and he's taken months to show anything at Newcastle. Jacob Ramsey took a long time. I think he's been brilliant recently, but he took a long time to settle in. There's no guarantee of any signing. It all comes down to the environment and, responding to what the coach is asking for you, gelling with the teammates, all that sort of thing happens, and there's not an exact science, but I think the extensive scouting and the data can give you a good guide of someone being successful, and you hope that Newcastle do go down this sort of brave new route, that it pays off, and I like to think it would do.
But does Eddie Howe also maybe got to change his ways slightly, because he's often accused of not putting enough faith in the youngsters? I mean, we've seen recently, you can go back to that Carabao game at St James Park, and Elia Schar and Sean Neve, not getting as many minutes as people expected when you're 6 or 7 goals, so they got to whatever it was that evening. I mean, first off, is that a fair accusation to throw at Eddie Howe? Because some people do say, look, he doesn't trust them enough. I guess he would argue that he watches them pretty much day in, day out. He has staff that he trusts to say, he's ready. And at the moment, no one's knocking on the door for a first team spot.
I would say that the difference would be is that, Leo Shahar's 17, 18, Sean Neve's 18. Eddie Howe probably doesn't think they're ready in terms of the experience that they have, and he sees them every day. Whereas I think if a signing comes in the summer who's 19, 20, 21 and has extensive first team experience, there's a different mindset there straight away, isn't there? And I think, the accusation that they didn't play them in that Carabao game, I think, was fair, because if you look back to it, it's pointless going to go around too much here, but that was a real opportunity to give them that sort of experience, because the game was done. It could have rested a few of the players who didn't need to play in that game in such a grueling period. And I think that's the frustration there, rather than A, are they good enough, and B, if Eddie Howe thinks they're good enough. The difference is going to be if the signings coming in are all of that age profile, and our first team ready signings, and are replacing players that are in the squad, he's going to have no choice to get on board with those players. So I think it'll be a collaborative thing, though. I don't think it's going to be something that's going to change drastically and it's all forced on Eddie Howe. He's got an excellent relationship with Ross Wilson. He's got a good relationship with David Hopkinson, and as much as we said at the start of the episode, where what Hopkinson said was left open for interpretation, and I do think that if that Liverpool end of the season, there's a major conversation to be had. At the minute, they're all aligned on this vision that it's going to be Eddie Howe leading this rebuild, and I don't think any club is healthy for players to be forced upon a manager who doesn't want to play them. There has to be some give and take on both sides, and I think there will be. And I think it is interesting when I asked Eddie Howe about those Ross Wilson quotes I mentioned before about the change in the Premier League strategy. This was back in December. I asked him about it, and he said that he trusts Ross Wilson to be an excellent sort of operator within the football industry. He's got a very good relationship with him, and I think the words he said to me was, Ross is a smart guy. He knows what he's doing in those circles. So the relationship's good. It's not going to be a case of players coming in who the manager doesn't want, and it's not going to be a case of players coming in who the sporting director and the club don't want. There's going to be some sort of compromise and meet in the middle, and I think that's a healthy way of any football club to operate.
Yeah, 100%. You mentioned Woltmade and Wissa. Just quickly, just reconfirm to our watchers and listeners, both stay in the summer, or do you think 1, 2 might go?
I think it depends on how the next 7 games go. I think the problem you've got is that they've spent so much money on them. It's like, do they turn their back on them after 12 months? I think there's going to be more suitors and more value in selling on Woltmade. Interesting day in Germany saying that Borussia Dortmund could look to him if Serhu Guirassy, their forward, leaves the club. There's some reports in Bill that he's itching to to get out of Dortmund after 2 seasons. So that's interesting. That could be one to watch in terms of Woltmade's future. I just don't see there being many suitors for Visser, given his age profile, given the fact that Newcastle paid a lot of money for him and he's been injured all season. He's, hasn't really made an impact at all. He scored 3 goals since he's come back from injury. I think from a business point of view, Newcastle look at it and think Woltmade is the one you want to keep because he's younger. He's definitely got the higher ceiling. The quality is undeniable. It's whether or not he fits the system and whether or not, if an interesting offer comes in for Woltmade, is it best for all parties to just say, look, we tried, it didn't work, we've made an expensive mistake. And I think that's going to be the interesting conversation, I think, in the summer. That'll be interesting as well, I think, with Guirassy. I think you'll have top suitors and it'll go against the sort of the age range policy of Newcastle. But that could be a question to ask, surely.
Quality strike, isn't he?
If Woltmade is a replacement at Dortmund, a potential replacement at Dortmund for him, surely that's a question Newcastle have got to ask and think. For 2 seasons, 30 to 32, he's going to guarantee you goals.
Yeah, it's sort of, there's loads of big questions to be answered, isn't there? Because say if Eddie Howe was to go in the summer, they might go out and get a new manager who actually changed the system completely to fit Nick Woltmade's style. And that's the issue. Like, you can't make a decision on Nick Woltmade until you've made a decision on Eddie Howe. And then even then, you've got to sit down and say, right, Eddie, we think he's a good player. Can we change the system? Is Eddie going to be on board with that? Like, there's so many permutations.
That's why I think it's a cliche thing, and I keep saying it, but the 7 games are so important because you just don't know. Like,
well, has he got to go back up top?
Yes, 100%. And I think if he doesn't go back up top, I don't understand what that means for him because, as I've just said there before, Lewis Miley's back, Bruno Guimaraes is back, Samuel Tonali's played for Italy, he'll be back. The 3 midfielders who started the derby, Joe Linton, 3 midfielders who were involved in the derby, Joe Linton, Joe Willock and Jacob Ramsey, because obviously Woltmade started the derby in midfield. The 6 midfielders are all going to be fit, touch wood, for this Crystal Palace game. If Nick Woltmade then continues in the midfielder, A, it says that they don't trust him to play up front anymore. And B, where does that leave him? Because clearly, as much as he's a talented footballer, he's nowhere near as good as any of those 6 players in midfield. So again, it's a thing where I think for his confidence and because he was put there to sort of put a square peg in a round hole at the time because of the injuries, surely you go back to him going up front. And whether or not you start, and whether or not you stay with Anthony Gordon is a different matter. But if you're going to bring him off the bench, you bring him off the bench as a forward and you let him try and prove himself in his position, because you saw his comments on international duty about the fact that he's playing so far away from goal. Julian Nagelsmann said the same thing before the international break. It can't be doing his confidence any good.
Well, he said, it bothers me if someone claims that I'm in a slump. I'd argue that this person doesn't watch many Newcastle games. I know people associate me with goals, but you can't compare a striker's tally with that of a midfielder playing 50, 60, 70 minutes from the importance goal. I'm currently a completely different Nick Woltmade than I was at the start of the season. Right now, I should be judged by how I handle duels or secure space, which obviously he's there quite aware of the criticism. Fair play to the lad for coming out and saying, wait there, like, this isn't on me. I'm doing my job as a midfielder when it's not even my natural position.
I'd also counter that with the fact that as much as I think he made a fantastic start to the season, it was only February that he got moved into that midfield position. So he had, from that Chelsea game where he scored 2 goals, he hasn't scored a goal in the Premier League. He scored 1 goal this calendar year. It was against Aston Villa in midfield. Yes, he shouldn't be judged on goals by playing in midfield, but I also suggest that he had plenty of opportunity in January to prove that he, to sort of counter that, which I think is a stick that his dissenters will beat him with, is that the goals did dry up. But then I also think that a young forward in his first season, there's going to be little sticky patches, and I think it's how he responds to it. And I just hope that Eddie Howe puts him back up front from the last 7 games. Again, he doesn't necessarily have to start every game, but just to let him, try and prove himself and prove that he can play there, because let's face it, he was bought as a £69 million forward. He wasn't bought as a project to put him in as a midfielder. He's clearly not suited playing there. Like, as much as I think he's done a grand job, and I think he's right in sort of coming out and batting for himself in self-defence, but he's just not a midfielder. It's not his fault, but if he remains a midfield option, I just don't see how that ends in anything other than him leaving the club in the summer, because he's a forward and he needs to play as a forward.
Is it a case, though, that he can just straight back into the formation, which we know it will be? Because there's an argument to say that actually you can play him up front in the formation that Howe uses, but he still isn't very effective.
Yeah. But then, like, I don't think, put it this way, I think Anthony Gordon starts up front on Sunday. I think that's a given. But I would like to see him sort of come on in his natural position. Quite clearly, if Newcastle want to play in a front foot, aggressive pressing style that they're famed for, where the intensity is absolutely, brimming, and I think they're going to do that in the fact that they've only got one game a week now, even more so. He isn't suited to that. It's as simple as that. And he's more suited to, I think one of his best games he had at Newcastle was against Union away, where they played over the high line and Elanga and Gordon played off him, and the damage that he was causing by doing a little touch in behind and those players running on. The space isn't there in the Premier League. Now, it's whether or not he can bring that to the Premier League, and the way that team's set up, I think he's going to struggle to do that. That said, his quality is undeniable, and you look back at some of the goals that he scored, absolutely fantastic. I think what he needs to work on is being in the box more, because I think when he's in the box, he's a fantastic finisher. He's fantastic with his head. And it's sort of just molded himself into more of a number 9. If you look at what he was doing in Stuttgart, he was sort of like a second striker. He was never really the main man. He played in a 2. And again, people will now shout and say, well, try him in the 10. They did that against Bournemouth, and it worked all right when him and Visser played together, but they lost a lot of control in midfield. And I think the way that Premier League team's set up now, the midfield battle is always key. And I feel like I've said this so many times. It's either he adapts Newcastle or the other way around. And if there's not a solution met in these next 7 games, I think there's a major decision coming in the summer.
Penultimate question then. I think you've already given the answer to it, but is there a striker which realistically you could see Newcastle United targeting? Is it Guirassy potentially?
I would love to see them go for Guirassy. Whether or not it's realistic, I don't know. Because the age range is a problem, because he's 30 already. So it's whether or not you sort of you're gambling on those 2 years, him firing you into these Champions League spots, into winning trophies, into competing at the high end of the table, and then having to replace him, especially if it ends up being him and Visser. I think that's a problem with 2 30-year-old forwards. He would be brilliant. I think if you look at the Premier League, obviously Igor Thiago would be a dream, but again, he's going to go for massive money now. He's scored the goals he has done for Brentford in the Premier League, so it probably pays Newcastle to sort of think outside the box and scour the European markets, maybe.
Maybe get the Thiago before.
Yes, before he goes to Brentford. Again, that might not sort of set tails wagging when it happens, but it might be the sensible way forward of doing it. But if you're asking me for a dream forward right now, it would be a Guirassy, a Thiago type. But I mean, there's plenty of examples of gems in Europe who are scoring plenty of goals. The name's escaping us now, but you can look it after the podcast. There's a fellow at Strasbourg, Argentinian international, who scored plenty of goals. I think it's like 60 and 27, but I can't remember his name.
He'll probably end up at Chelsea, right?
Well, that's the thing.
But let us know in the comments if you've got any suggestions of who the dream striker, a realistic option could be this summer, if indeed you want to see Newcastle cash in on one or both of Nick Voldemare and Johan Wissa. The final question then, Sean, and it's quite topical given that the training ground sponsor was announced last week, which is fantastic news. Yeah. Knox Hydration on the sleeve, and the training ground from July the 1st will be called the Knox. But this one's all about the shirt sponsor. Comes from Bob1892, who's got in touch. There was a report over the weekend, I think it was in The Guardian, which said quite a few Premier League teams are struggling with their front of shirt sponsors for their kit. And the Seller deal is thought to end this summer, £25 million it was worth over the time. Newcastle are one of those clubs reportedly at the moment without a front of shirt sponsor. And the question is, do you think that'll happen? Do you think it will happen, i.e. they won't be able to sign up a front of shirt sponsor?
I'd be surprised. I think the importance that David Hopkinson's placed on the commercial opportunities that they can affect instantly, I'd be amazed if there's not something in place or something already in the pipeline. If it's not Seller announcing an extension of the deal, I think Hopkinson will have something in place. I think obviously we said 2 weeks ago when I was on the podcast that it was annoying that they didn't have the training ground sponsor. They've got that in place now with Knox. Fort Knox, as one fan put on social media, which I really liked. So I'd be absolutely stunned if there's not something in place before the start of the season. I think it would be borderline negligent if there wasn't in place, because we've seen the financial figures come out last week and the importance of getting everything in-house right, because there's still a massive gap between Newcastle and the big 6 clubs, commercially, even match day revenue, which I'm going to do a piece on for the morning. there's so many avenues that they're still sorely lacking behind the big six, and that's something that they can help themselves with. And I think that's something that Hopkinson said a lot, is a lot of self-help's needed at the club. So for them not to get something in place for the start of the season, I'd be absolutely amazed, because it is that sort of, he put it as a sort of rock sponsorship, the foundation that they can build on. And if it's not Salah, you'd like to think of something that sort of takes it on another level in terms of the money that they get pumping in. It'll be interesting to see if it isn't on that level. And of course, the questions then come in terms of, well, why not, and why is it sort of going in the wrong direction? But I'd be amazed if that's the case. So long story short, I'll be absolutely stunned. It wouldn't be, I think it was Chelsea went a while, didn't they? A couple of years ago, where they didn't have a front of shirt sponsor. But I think it'll be an own goal for Newcastle in the current climate not to have it in place.
I guess it'll be the bigger picture will be the impact of having the betting ban on sponsors. And of course, with Newcastle as well, many people would say, well, it's not so like go and get another PAF related company, but that brings its own. Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But again, as I said last week, if one man can do it, then I'm fully backing Dave Hopkinson to be that man, because I've got full faith in him, with his CV, with his experience, with this Knox deal, that if one man can pull it out the hat, it will be.
Well, that's his strength, isn't it? He's not a football man, but commercially he's fantastic. And as you said, his CV, Toronto Raptors, Real Madrid, MSG, is top notch. So hopefully get something in place for the start of the season.
There we go. Well, thank you very much, Sean, for popping out into the wonderful sunny Leazes Park. Thank you to you guys for watching and listening. Do hit thumbs up, do hit like, do get into the comments and subscribe to the channel as well, and let us know your thoughts on anything that me and Sean have discussed today. And I'll be back later in the week with the match preview with John Gibson and the view from the opposition ahead of the trip to Crystal Palace. Until then, keep yourselves safe and enjoy the sunshine. We'll catch you in a bit.